Hello, and welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Catherine Von Frost III, Some Dude 267, Bright Line Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Dark Lightning 1536, and Master of None. You are the reason why this content remains ambitious. And today we are going to discuss some ambitious ideas in the history of railroading and trains in general. Mass transportation has gone through many eras. Many ideas have come and gone. Some were good, some were bad, and when it comes to creating something new, something better, sometimes you have to fail. And experimentation is always encouraged when it comes to these types of things. You never really know if a design is going to work until it's actually put into use. And when it comes to trains, well, there have been definitely cases where a really weird idea was attempted, and it just didn't work. Here's 5 ambitious attempts to redesign trains that failed. The Sailbogie, or the Sail Trolley. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I started this being positive, saying we always encourage new ideas, but, how new is this idea? I mean, it's not really a new concept, it's, actually very old. It is exactly what it looks like. The Sailbogies were effectively just handcars, except they were equipped with sails, like on a sailboat. And yes, they used the power of the wind to propel themselves along tracks. And I don't think I need to explain why this idea never really became common practice. But in case you're wondering, I will happily explain it. It's because, look, you don't want your train to be dependent upon the weather this much. A more conventional locomotive, whether it be steam, diesel, or electric, is always going to be able to move, regardless of which direction the wind is blowing, because they operate under their own power. This doesn't have its own power. It requires the wind. But they did see some limited use in many capacities. The Spurn Railway, which was built along Spurn Head on the Yorkshire coast of England during the First World War, and wound up being there till the 1950s, actually included these as a part of their rolling stock. And in the early days of the Teesmouth Lifeboat, crews were actually able to use these to travel out to the lifeboat station at South Gare, but it was always dependent on the wind, and that really was their biggest flaw. They just needed the wind all the time. Why would you ever utilize one of these? I mean, even a regular handcar requires you, not the wind. Maybe they're cute as a novelty, but in terms of mass appeal, they were never really gonna be that useful. Jean Bertin's Aerotrain. Not to be confused with General Motors' Aerotrain, which was just straight up bad. Jean Bertin's Aerotrain was a tracked air cushion vehicle, or TACV, and it was much more ambitious and arguably better than GM's lazy outing, which was just a regular switcher diesel-electric that had a different shell around it. It was developed in France between 1965 and 1977, and the thought that it was going to change the way trains operated. Instead of using old, rusty rails, the train would travel on a cushion of air through a simple reinforced concrete track, or a guideway, that was elevated, and the whole concept would have reduced resistance on the train itself, allowing it to move at much higher speeds. The end goal would have been to create a high-speed travel network, but not utilizing typical rail-based technology. It was an interesting concept and very ambitious, and in some ways it was quite good. Several prototypes were built over the years, some using reversible pitch propellers, and some using turbojet engines, like a crazy mad scientist, but John really believed in his project. And perhaps if actual funds were put into producing an actual network of this type of track system, It might have actually worked to a certain degree. The prototypes were very fast, and one even set a speed record for overland air cushion vehicles on the 5th of March 1974, with a mean speed of 417.6 kilometers an hour. That's 259.5 miles per hour. So in terms of traveling at high speeds, these things could definitely do it. And it's possible the designs could have changed how people travel today. So what went wrong? Well, for one thing, Jean Bertin was diagnosed with cancer, and he was overworked after spending a decade on this project, and he wound up passing away in December of 1975. Without him at the helm, the project just kind of fizzled out, and its major flaw was simply something that nobody could ever overcome. It was the tracks. The elevated concrete tracks. They would require a significant amount of money in order to invest in building, well, a lot of them, to actually make them efficient. Rails may be old, but they're also familiar, and there's many places where they're already integrated into the landscape. If you're building a high-speed train, you don't necessarily have to create a whole new system of tracks for that train to run on. A traditional high-speed train can still utilize the already existing track to a certain degree. It's true, some require more specialized tracks to be built that can handle those high speeds, but even if those tracks end at the traditional stations that again are already in place, the high-speed trains can go on the regular lines at less speed. The Aérotrain could never have done this, as it used a completely different and unfamiliar track setup, and getting financial backing to invest in a completely different kind of infrastructure that in itself was actually more expensive to create, as the lines were meant to be elevated off the ground. You can see why the project wound up being abandoned. And it's a shame, because I do think the technology here is actually very impressive, and possibly could have been revolutionary if more people than just John had truly believed in it. The Gyro Monorail. Okay, that's something. There's actually several versions of this type of monorail setup, but the most famous example was probably the one by Louis Brennan, who filed the first patent for it in 1903. You may be wondering, this is a monorail that uses one rail, how in the world does it stand upright? Well, that's why it's called a gyroscopic monorail. It uses the gyroscopic action of a spinning wheel to maintain its center of balance. It's actually quite ingenious, to be honest. Simple, but effective. It could stay upright. And in Brennan's case, by the 15th of October 1909, the railcar wound up running under its own power and carried 32 people around the factory that they were testing it at. And although Brennan's example would wind up failing, other inventors would pick up where he left off and create even more gyro monorail ideas, such as August Scherl and Piotr Szulowski. So why didn't this work? Why wasn't this a new thing? I mean, it could stay upright. The infrastructure that you would need to put down for a rail line based on this technology would be, well, cut in half effectively. But the problem was down to capacity. It's true that the rail cars themselves could carry a decent amount of people, but what people were really looking at was, as a rail line, how many cars could it pull behind it? And the answer was, not many. Not without their own powered gyroscope wheels inside of them. The balancing idea with a gyroscope really only worked for one car at a time, so basically, for every car you added behind the first one, they would each need their own individually powered gyroscope. This problem was something that simply couldn't be overcome, because any costs you might save in setting down the rails were completely destroyed the second you had to power every single car that was going down the lines. Compare that to a regular railway, where, yeah, the engine would be powered, but then, like in the modern day, we have freight trains that are hundreds of cars long, and not a single one has to have any power whatsoever. Only the engines do. It doesn't make any financial sense in that regard, which is a real shame because, again, it's a brilliant concept that absolutely worked in practice. It's just not financially reasonable. And the other issue was relevant to safety. Since the gyroscope always had to be powered, well, what if there was a failure in the engine? The engine was powered by gasoline. It was very simple, which is fine, but what if something went wrong? Then the gyroscope would cut off. Would you then just fall off the tracks? Again, if a normal train suffers a power failure, usually it would just, stop, But in this case, if it was going at speed, there was a risk of it falling to the side and possibly hurting somebody. No attempts with the technology really caught on with any kind of investors, so that's why we don't have gyroscopic monorails these days. The Benny Railplane. With a concept that's oddly reminiscent of the Schienen Zeppelin, but admittedly with much more foresight when it comes to safety, the Railplane, as he called it, was invented by a man by the name of George Benny, who was from Glasgow, Scotland. And it was an interesting concept, basically reversing how rails worked. Instead of going the way of the Schienen Zeppelin and using a propeller on the ground, right next to people, which would maul them horribly, Benny decided to elevate his railplane off the ground. This way the propeller was not at risk of actually hurting anybody, and he envisioned them actually operating over top of traditional rail lines to save on space. And that's actually a novel concept. It's clear he had some clever ideas here. He knew that the large, heavy freight service that regular trains provided would never work with his concept, but he thought his idea with the railplane could be used for very fast passenger and mail service, or perhaps even perishable goods. And he figured eventually it could actually travel about 120 miles per hour, or 193 kilometers per hour, which for the early 1930s when he was actually testing the prototype was actually pretty good. And it did work to a certain degree, but the problem was that he couldn't obtain any financial backing. No one believed in it like Benny did. And again, there was the infrastructure issue. It's true that Benny had thought about it more and planned to actually build his lines over existing rail lines, therefore eliminating the extra space issue. It wouldn't take up any more space technically, because it would already be over lines that were already there. But you'd still have to build them. You'd still have to fund that, and this was in the 1930s, when the Great Depression was happening. It just wasn't a good time for something that, hey, this is revolutionary and great, also it's gonna cost just so much money. Because nobody had it. Benny, who truly believed in the project, wound up funding his research mostly himself. By 1937, he was bankrupt. The prototype was left to rust in the field until 1956, when it was eventually sold for scrap, and poor Benny died the following year. And it's a real shame, because I know I came down hard on the Schienen Zeppelin, but the way Benny went about it, I feel like he had a lot more clever ideas here. Like he really tried to make it safe and reasonable, and went out of his way to make sure it was something that might actually help people out. But no one believed in him. It was bad timing financially, and it was just too weird of an idea to really take off. It's actually kind of a sad story when you put it that way. The Beach Pneumatic Public Transit System. Hey guys, how would you like, and follow me on this, would you love to be jammed inside a literal tin can, which in itself is stuck inside another metal pipe, and then propelled along at unreasonable speeds by the expanding air behind you, and only stopping because the air was reversed by a vacuum, and that slows you down? If you think that sounds like a great idea, you are either Elon Musk working on the Hyperloop, or you are the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company, because it's exactly what they created, and opened to the public on February 26, 1870. Oh yes, everyone has spent the last few years complaining about Musk and the Hyperloop. No, that's not a new idea at all. The Beach Pneumatic Transit Company already did it well back in the 1800s, and it served to prove that, no. The cars, which again, might as well just be tin cans at this point, could hold 22 people. And the line itself was created more as a demonstrator of the technology, because what Beach Pneumatic Transit wanted to do was create an underground transit network in New York City, a la the New York City subway, but well before the New York City subway would actually be created in the way we know about it now. This was the first real attempt at doing that, and in that regard, it's actually quite ingenious. Back then, creating a network like that would have been very difficult with traditional locomotives because they were steam, and steam locomotives produced a lot of exhaust, and you can't stick them in an all-underground area because they'll suffocate everybody. The pneumatic system was supposed to be a fix for that, and it could have arguably gone a lot faster, but there's just so many things that can go wrong with this. For one thing, you're dependent entirely on a push-pull configuration. The tin can itself had no way of stopping itself. So if the 44 short-ton Roots blower, which they nicknamed the Western Tornado, failed at all, you would be slamming into the opposite end of the tunnel, or getting stuck in there. It doesn't really meet modern safety standards in that regard, though I do give them credit for coming up with something new, except that it wasn't new, because technically there was the Crystal Palace Pneumatic Railway that operated in South London in 1864, but that was again more of a novelty, and wasn't quite as ambitious as the whole underground system they had going on here. Pneumatic railways in general are flawed not only in the safety sense, because it's hard to know what to do about an emergency in this situation, but my biggest thing with it is this. Consider that description I gave you. You expect us to jump inside a literal tin can and be propelled off at God knows how fast of speeds in a steel pipe and hope for the best. That's really what these situations are. We have to put a lot of trust in you. Again, at least with regular traditional trains, you can always jump out of them in the event of an emergency. The pneumatic railways require an enclosed space to work, so if something went wrong like a fire, how would you get out? Please explain, Elon. I just want to know what you're thinking with the Hyperloop. It's true the Hyperloop isn't pneumatic. It would use magnetic levitation, which, great, but it still kind of has the same issue, if I'm being honest. I'm all for dreaming and imagining, but we've tried it before. It didn't work. It wasn't really something people want to use every day, is what I'm trying to say. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell. Wait, I think did I just get through a list? And not have to mention... Am I free? Has my curse been lifted? Have I served my sentence? I'm free! I'm free!